here, which stands for Together Individual Entertainment. Alright, so on September 13th, I got to experience McKeesport Heritage Center Living Tour. That means they're talking about history, and yet they've got people pretending to be other people from the 18th century, the 19th century. We're talking like people who are already dead, but they portrayed them. So basically, I hope you guys enjoy.
People, we don't know who they are. They could have been poets, they could have been artists, they could have been a child that never got the chance to achieve greatness. Just as the markers do, the funerals that I have watched also tell a lot about the deceased. The wealthy and well-connected funerals were always carried in a solemn procession, a solemn long procession. Close family members arrived by limousine, and elaborate flower arrangements surrounded the waiting graves. Tents awaited to shelter the next of kin, and the chairs were placed next to the grave to accommodate the mourners. Well-dressed pallbearers always carried the casket and placed the casket gently into the ground. Now, our funerals are very similar. Like, we have the family and the clergy that speaks words of, eternal life. We have pallbearers, but they might not have been as formal. The flower arrangements might not have been as elaborate, but still the funerals are very similar. Unfortunately, a pauper's funeral is completely different from both styles of those funerals. For a pauper's funeral, few, if any, people followed the hearse. If they had any friends left, very few followed the hearse. If the mortician was free, they might be the only person to attend the funeral. And there was always two grave diggers standing very close by, just chit-chatting about their day, to lower the very flimsy wooden casket into the ground. It's very sad. But when winter comes and the snow covers all the graves, all the souls are equal. And I often think of Thomas Gray's words. The paths lead not but to the grave. The paths of glory lead, but not to the grave. And I wander among the tombstones and the squares, and I laugh to myself, because I see children and even some adults shiver as they walk through the cemetery. They move a little faster. Cemeteries have that effect on some people. What they do not realize is that they have no fear. They should have no fear of my citizens in this city. They can't harm you. The dead is not who you need to fear. I'm at peace here. Once the funerals are done for the day and the visitors have gone home, my city belongs to my citizens and myself again. And I think of another poem by Longfellow. The day is done, and the darkness falls from the wings of night, as a feather is wafted downward from an eagle in its flight. And the night shall be filled with music, and the cares that infest the day will fold up their tents like Arabs and silently slip away. Thank you for being patient with my meanderings.
4 years later, in 1948, I received a shock equal to that of Robert's death. I was no longer a young woman, but I was still naive. One winter evening, a man I did not know, Owen Holleran, approached me at my home. I showed him into the library, where I thought he'd tell me of his causes, but as he spoke, I became more and more confused. I had trouble understanding exactly what it was he was trying to tell me. When I sorted it all out in my mind, I was stunned. He told me that he had met a man in a Pittsburgh hotel who had shown him pictures of my deceased husband in a compromising situation with a woman. They were in a car. He said that the man had agreed to give him the pictures, that they would be destroyed if I would pay him. My mind swirled. I felt faint. What was I to do? How much money does this man want? I gasped. $1,500, he replied. You will never get that money from me, I rasped. Leave my home. As he made his way to the door, I instructed him. Come back in 10 days. I need to think. Our second meeting only worsened my predicament. Holleran kept his eyes on my face, all trace of respect gone. He nearly growled. Look, if you don't pay up, that man is going to send 150 of those pictures to McKeesport families. Is that how you want your husband to be remembered? As a philanderer? At his death, Robert had been remembered with respect and admiration for all of the good that he'd done for the city, the hospital, the country club. The words that Shakespeare put in Mark Antony's mouth sprang to mind. The evil men do live after them. The good are oft interred with their bones. Only I could protect his good name. Only I could keep his reputation from being dragged through the mud. He would be shamed, and I would be pitied and disgraced. So, after much consideration and a lengthy conversation, I $750. He wanted cash. I insisted on a check. I may have been naive, but I was not stupid, and I wanted a paper trail. I made this notation on my checkbook stub. I think he is a blackmailer. Upon leaving my house, he immediately cashed the check. As discreet as I tried to be, one of my employees evidently overheard my conversations and tipped off McKeesport detective Hudson Kenny. Detective Kenny contacted me. He told me that Holleran was absolutely no stranger to the police and agreed that he was probably trying to blackmail me. He convinced me to help him lay a trap for Holleran. After he discussed it with Mayor Charles Kincaid and Police Chief William Freeling, Kenny coached me, and we baited the snare. He gave me leading questions to post Holleran. I admit to being nervous. I mean, who wouldn't be? I never pictured myself as a part of a plot to catch a criminal. On January 24th, at the appointed time, I once again...
Part of it. And growing up on White Street made for a happy childhood, seeing as the neighborhood blended like one giant family. All the moms were everyone's moms. I remember one of them yelling at me, "Jitters, get down off that roof or I'll tan your hide." And I knew she would, so down I came. In my teenage years, I had a growing interest in sports, especially football. As a McKeesport Tiger, I was no putting grace and shucking and jiving with the ball around. My attribute was speed. My buddy Wayne Dobis crowed. It was like he was shot out of a cannon. He just whizzed right by everyone. I also like to sing too. I won a talent show at the Memorial Theater, not to brag, but I represented the Sam LaRose's Boys Club there. Music also bonded me to my African-American pals as we get together in hallways, bathrooms, wherever we could, harmonizing to popular rhythm and blues tunes of the day. My personal favorite was In the Still of Night. I'd be lying if I said all my youthful excursions were exactly innocent, seeing as one night, close friend John Hernandez and I decided that it'd be a great idea to go peeping through neighbors' windows. And our youthful excursion was paid off one night whenever a beautiful young lady was pacing back and forth in front of her window, completely naked. Looking back, not my proudest moment, but the memory lingers on. There were quiet times too, where me, John Hernandez, and Chucky McLaughlin would hang out, sipping on Boone Apple Farm wine tea, or Iron City beer, just reminiscing of good old times that we've had. But no matter how flivorous our conversations got, it inevitably and eventually landed on the Vietnam War. I was stunned the night they told me that they wanted to join the Marine Corps. I didn't understand why anyone would want to join an unpopular cause, seeing as soldiers returning home from Vietnam did not receive a hero's welcome. That is until Sam LaRosa, founder of the Boys Club and mentor to us all, decided he was going to honor his boys. And on Veterans Day in 1966, I was proud that Sam chose me to lay down the wreath at the memorial as taps wafted in the air. And at that point, I understood. I got it. I knew what I had to do. Barely 18, full of youthful confidence in my own immortality, I decided to follow my two friends into the hellhole of Vietnam.
To meet you folks. You'll forgive me for looking staggered, but you have to understand that Tube Company was a hub. It was a coined phrase for the bosses in those days to tell you that you're producing the iron and steel that's building America. And the mills often caught the attention of the savviest of businessmen. Heck, even when I died, there was talk of two businessmen from other states coming in to try to buy up the mill and create a big powerhouse company. Those nice folks I talked to recently told me that ended up happening, and that eventually the mill went on for nearly a century after I died. They tell me that in 1899, two entrepreneurs, a lawyer, William Nelson Cromwell, and a banker, Edmund C. Converse, merged 13 small companies to create the largest producer of tubular products in the world, and they kept the National Tube Company's name. They say that eventually Andrew Carnegie's steel partnership, U.S. Steel, bought it and turned it into the National Tube Works, and that it went on to employ folks throughout the Mon Valley as well as immigrants from afar, well into the 1980s. You folks know, is that true? What a legacy. Oh, don't let me glamorize it too much, though. It wasn't easy working in the mills, and it wasn't safe. My literal sweat and blood went into that place. And that's no joke. In 1892, that place killed me. The National Tube Company went on to employ tens of thousands of people, but I saw it in its youthful days when I was one of about 10,000 employees working at the tube company in the 1890s. I was living in Pittsburgh. I was working as a mate on the river. The Civil War had been over for about 3 years when I decided to move to McKeesport. Wanted a better life for my family, so I worked at the tube company for 19 years, and I took that job because I wanted a better life for all of us, especially after little Jacob Jr. was born. So, my wife Kazai and I packed up the 7 kids and moved out to McKeesport, just in time for the National Tube Company to open up and start an industrial revolution in our town. Just 8 years after moving here, the population grew by more than 4 times. But it wasn't perfect, and nobody ever said it was safe. You can imagine that maybe you'd pack a lunch, but many didn't, because they never had time to sit down and eat it. The place was massive, and yet you worked in close, tight, dangerous quarters. You left the place filthy, and many had to enter their homes through the basement so as not to get scolded by the wife for ruining the rugs or a piece of furniture.
That I lived with my dear wife Hazel, located along Shaw Avenue. I have many wonderful memories of that place, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I was born in North Versailles on February 9th, 1912. One of my fondest childhood memories were the oil wooden derricks that were being built in the boroughs. I was about 8 years old when their construction was complete, but it's a sight I will never forget. My mother was a wonderful woman. Her name was Janie, and she was very active in the McKeesport community. I'm sure you've all heard of the Semper Fidelis Club. My mother was a founding member. She and a couple of other African American housewives wanted to find a way to promote education, community leadership, and civic improvement in McKeesport. It was my mother that instilled within me, and many others in the community, what is truly important in life. She believed that actions speak louder than words, and she lived out her faith. She was wise and funny and kind, and provided me with a firm foundation to pursue my dreams. She died in 1977, and I can only hope to continue just a little bit of the legacy she left for us all at Treasure. Because of my mother's foundation, I was able to accept when my dreams of becoming a doctor were dashed. I graduated from McKeesport in 1930, and I was accepted as a pre-med student at Northwestern University. However, my family didn't have a lot of money, so I couldn't afford to go. But this didn't stop me from continuing my education. You see, I continued to study at various public libraries in McKeesport, and using the funds that I made working as the head waiter at the Penn McKee, I was able to go to various night colleges in Pittsburgh. Some would say I was self-motivated. Others would say I set some mighty lofty goals for myself. For instance, one time, my brother Albert and I, we set out to build an airplane. But not just one of those models, mind you. We wanted to build a full-sized airplane. This didn't work out too well, but it did spark an intellectual curiosity for me to continue inventing things. And I invented many things, and I'll tell you much more about in just a moment. My mother built my foundation, and my wife Hazel helped me build upon it. We first met at a party, but our true love story begins when we met at a program at a church. Although I played Sunshine of Your Smile for her on my trombone, and she's been the sunshine of my life ever since. We were married in January of 1935, and we had one child, Phyllis. She followed in her mother's footsteps to become a journalist, and later she became a professor at Columbia University. I have a feeling you're going to hear a lot more about her in just a couple minutes.
Female editor-in-chief at the Pittsburgh Courier when it was the most widely circulated African-American paper in the country. Her journey to this historic milestone began with her reporting on small club activities on a part-time basis while I was a child. She wrote a column and was editor for the entertainment and women's sections before being named editor-in-chief, the first woman to ever reach that position at the Courier. During that time, she was the first African-American journalist to write a regular TV column, Video Vignettes, which became one of the longest-running TV columns in all of newspaper history. One of the reasons my mother was such an inspiration to me is because she accomplished all of that and never even graduated high school. My mother loved to sing, dance, and play drums for local bands. You know, it was music that brought my parents together. They met at a party, but she fell in love with him when he played a trombone solo at a church program. For the 50th wedding anniversary, about 300 family and friends gathered to share that special day with them. I had the honor of speaking at a Semper Fidelis Club program, where my mother was the honoree. Knowing a little bit about my parents, especially my mother, makes it easy to understand why I traveled down the road I did, and why I took some of the side roads I did. I guess you'd have to say it was in my blood. After graduating high school, I went to Northwestern University's Mental School of Journalism and graduated in 1957. I did some graduate work before returning to the area, following in my mother's footsteps as an editor and reporter for the Pittsburgh Courier. I never reached the level my mother did at the time, but it was an honor to see her work and the legacy she left behind. When I first started at the Courier, the civil rights movement was in full swing. I got to travel to Binghamton, New York, to talk to the widow of William Lynch. He was a white male man shot to death after attempting a freedom march in Jackson, Mississippi. I did 2 articles, hoping to provide a glimpse into who he was and the impact of his death. I covered the Freedom March on Washington, did a series about the African-American labor movements, and even did a couple stories about housing, education, and arts. Someone must have thought what I was writing was good, because I earned a Golden Quill Award for my work. I enjoyed my time at the paper, but a door opened at Ebony magazine, and I just couldn't pass it up. And I'm so glad I didn't. I got to travel through the Deep South, doing research on Fannie Lou Hamer and other African-American women involved in the movement. A few years later, I traveled to Mississippi and did stories about the first African-Americans elected to public office since the Reconstruction.
What's wrong? Your feet?
My name is William Height. I could tell you lots of stories, but I reckon anyone that's lived 102 years could do that. Now, I worked in the mines and I worked in the mills around here. But I'm not from McKeesport initially. I was born in Lancaster, PA in 1839. But I moved to McKeesport in 1873 when there was only about 45 houses in town. Oh, McKeesport's been good to me. I get to ride in all of the parades as the last living Civil War soldier. They applaud and cheer as I drive by, and I feel like a motion picture star. Let me go back a ways. When I was growing up, there was no such thing as public school. In fact, you had to spend a quarter for every day that you went to school. And a lot of the poor people's kids, well, they couldn't go. But I was lucky. I got to go 1 day a week. Even so, I learned to read and write. And when I turned 18, I joined the Virginia militia in what is now West Virginia. But when the War of the States broke out, I took my stand with President Abraham Lincoln and joined the 4th Ohio Infantry as, of all things, a musician. Now, I'd never picked up a musical instrument before, so it didn't really work out. They made me a fighting soldier. Didn't have much luck as a fighting soldier either. I was wounded 4 times in battle. One time a pumpkin ball got shot through the side of my head, but I survived it. But unfortunately, 3 of my brothers were killed in battle. Now, the battles, they came one right after another, and they were tough, every one of them. You know? the weather. There were days when there wasn't enough food to eat. And there were nights when your blood-soaked socks would stick to the inside of your worn-out boots. Them battles, they just kept coming. Battle at Romney, Moorfield, Cheat River, Winchester, and the biggest one of all, Gettysburg. Now, it wasn't always about fighting the enemy either. Sometimes we would stand guard duty. In one such instance, we were standing guard on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. We weren't allowed to speak to anybody when we were doing this, but a tall, kindly-faced man approached and said good morning. Now, I just ignored him, just like I should, and he just carried on. He was talking about the clothing on the statues around town. Eventually I said, "Sir, I'm not allowed to speak to you," but then I realized who it was. It was none other than our president, Abraham Lincoln. Now, we spoke for about a half an hour after that. Of course, it was against the rules, but he's the president, so I wound up getting invited to the White House, which I certainly went many times after that, in fact. Just think of it, Abraham Lincoln. Now, there was a president, the best we ever had.
My parents' friends included some of the most best-known people in all of McKeesport. I suppose my teenage years were like most every other kid at my station. I was a member of the Demoli. I spent my summers at the country club with my friends. And in high school, I played basketball, football, and golf. After graduation, my parents could afford to send me to Valley Forge Military Academy. That is where I would spend the rest of my time getting my education. I hadn't been home since Christmas. It was Easter. Me and 4 other students were headed home for Easter on an airplane ride that we had won for academic excellence. Now, in 1936, air travel was still fairly new, so it was to be quite an adventure. We showed up to the airport full of anticipation. Out on the tarmac sat the Douglas DC-2, called the Sun Racer. When we boarded the plane, we met Chief Pilot Ferguson and Flight Attendant Nellie Granger. Chief Pilot Ferguson was supposed to fly us to Allegheny County Airport, using his beacon and his compass. Unbeknownst to us, the beacon at Allegheny County was broken, and it led us 8 degrees off course. By the time we were supposed to land in Pittsburgh, we ended up in Connellsville, PA, 30 miles away from where we were supposed to be. Ferguson radioed in. "Coming into Pittsburgh, is it okay to land?" No response. He said the radio signal was very weak. He hailed them again. "This is Chief Pilot Ferguson, flying blind at 3,000 feet. The fog was terrible. Ferguson couldn't see the ground." Those were Ferguson's last words. The rest can only be inferred. Experts say that when Ferguson went down to land, at the last second he realized he was off course, and he began following a small stream. Heavy ice had formed on the wings. None of us knew we were in danger until we saw the trees flashing past the windows. Ferguson didn't have time to wrestle with the nose of the plane before we crashed into the side of Cheat Mountain. Only 3 survived. One of those 3 was Nellie Granger. She was thrown from the plane and knocked out. The DC-2 was flipped over, torn apart, and began to burn. When Nellie woke up, she pulled 2 other passengers out of that crumpled mess. Then she followed telephone wires 4 miles to the nearest house. Then she called TWA and told them of the calamity. One of the people Nellie pulled out gave a chilling account. His name was C.G. Chandler. He said, "With 2 broken legs, I tried to crawl out of that crumpled mess. Nellie pulled me out. I turned just in time to see the plane burst into an inferno. I could hear the screams and misery of those still stuck inside." Was one of those screams mine? No. My parents were devastated. My father said that his only comfort was that he was told that I died a painless death with no suffering.
Well, as Uncle Sam. You see, for 25 years, I portrayed Uncle Sam in every patriotic parade here in McKeesport. I guess after you do something for that long, that's what people remember you for. And I don't mind one bit, because I was always very proud to represent this wonderful country whenever I could. Now let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born on March 4th, 1876, in Irwin. My parents, Joseph and Louise, along with hundreds of other families, had just settled into that rather new community. People began moving there after the Pennsylvania Railroad Company completed the Brush Creek Valley Line in 1852, and, well, I guess my parents wanted to take advantage of the work there, from agriculture as well as coal and gas mining. Now, when I was still a child, my parents moved here to McKeesport, where my dad was a local carpenter. I will never forget the time that he got to go to a convention all the way out in Chicago. Well, that was a long way away, and we had no idea what it was like. We couldn't wait for him to come back and to tell us all about his big trip. By now, you have probably noticed that I'm rather tall. To answer the question you're probably all wondering, I am 6 feet, 7.5 inches tall. I was a full head and shoulders above all of my classmates, but I didn't play basketball. I probably would have made the team, but, well, you see, basketball wasn't invented until 1891, and even then I still hadn't made its way here to Western Pennsylvania. Now, I've just talked about education. Well, when I went to school in the 1880s, it was a lot different than what you folks probably went through. We were in a one-room schoolhouse that was rather small, and, well, you'd better hope you liked your teacher, because you had the same one for 8 years. In the winter, we had to carry a log with us to school, bringing it up and down those hills as we marched our way to the one-room schoolhouse. Paper was really expensive, so our notebooks were thin pieces of slate that we wrote on with a slate pencil made of clay. We had 5 subjects: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. Now, textbooks were really scarce, so we made do with, well, whatever we could. The worst part about school, though, well, that was the punishment. You see, when we misbehaved, we were made to sit in the front of the classroom wearing a dunce cap. I am ashamed to admit that I had to wear that cap on more than one occasion. Sure was embarrassing. Now, growing up, I had 2 sisters, Marge and Edna, and a brother, Clarence. I also had 2 uncles, my dad's brothers, W.D. and Robert. Now, W.D. was an innkeeper, a hotel innkeeper, many, many miles away in a town called Confluence. Yeah. As a matter of fact, it was called the Hotel Gilchrist. And I got to tend bar there for a week in 1904. Well, my brother went to the World's Fair out in St. Louis.
Life ended. My husband, Robert Souls, and me, Lou Souls. Discharged from the Army, Bob courted me, and we married in 1920. We were very much in love then. We had a gracious home on Jenny Lynch Street here in McKeesport. It's gone now, having been demolished after the scandal surrounding the funeral director who loved it. He was found guilty of stripping the bodies of dead babies he was contracted to cremate. Anyway, Bob and our happiness was complete when our son Kenneth was born. Our joy, however, was short-lived. Only 2 years old, and Kenneth died in his sleep in the library that choked the life out of him. Yet another blow came to our heart when our second child died at birth. Mother never gets over the loss of her children. And although I carried my grief with me forever, Bob and I moved on. We joined the social life of the city, frequently hosting parties, which I admit had the liquor flowing quite freely. My father, Harry Lynch, and I were very close. In fact, he had a room upstairs from ours. In 1932, we traveled to Florida to visit my brother John. In Miami, I met a William Martin, and we embarked on an inappropriate relationship. To my dismay, we caught an infection that neither of us quite recovered from, despite over 30 visits to Dr. Eugene Lowe, Miami physician, and out of some misguided sense of guilt, I paid for all of our treatments. Meanwhile, Bob was back in McKeesport going about his life, selling real estate. That wasn't all he was doing. His drinking steadily increased, and he took up with a widow, Rose Hardy, who kept an apartment above his offices. Like mine, their relationship was inappropriate for a married man. No surprise there, though, however. Bob once told a friend of mine that no woman could ever hold him. Obviously, I couldn't. By June 19th, I was dead. A gunshot wound to my stomach had killed me. After a night of heavy drinking and other things, conversation about what people were to think about who was to blame for my accident. He insisted I didn't want him to count them, so he brought me a pen and paper and a phone book to hold it in, and he swears I wrote the following note. Dear Bob, I'm no good to me or anybody else, and I'm getting worse in place of that. Please forgive me for what I've done, and I signed it LaRue, loving. He then placed it on the dresser. In his befuddled state, he then puts on his pajamas and starts reading the newspaper for about 25 minutes. Then, upon hearing my moans of pain, he returned to the bedroom and realized how very ill I was. So he sent for my father. He came downstairs, and realizing the gravity of the situation, he sent Bob to fetch Dr. Jordan. The three of them then decided it was best that they sent for the police. When Officer Connolly and Lieutenant Eccles arrived, Bob said that I had shot myself. He gave them the note, and then he took them to the bedroom where the gun was lying underneath the bed.
To rest in this very ground. I left behind a wife, 3 children who loved me and whom I loved dearly. My name is George McClure, and I did my best to live a virtuous life. In fact, Susan Atkins, a Sunday school student of mine, once remarked that I was the nicest man she ever knew. Susan was eventually married to a man named Ward McConkey. We'll hear more about him as we move along. Well, I was a shopkeep, and it was the most important thing in my life that I provide well for my young family. In fact, on the last day of my life, I opened up my general store and was amazed and angered to find that a large quantity of my goods had been stolen. Immediately, I raised an alarm, and 20 of my fellow citizens, all armed and mounted, joined me in pursuit of the outlaws. Easily enough, we followed the wagon trail left behind, and it led us to a place known ever since as Dead Man's Hollow. Nowadays, the Hollow seems as nice a place as any along the Yawk. It's a nature reserve, proliferate with wildflowers and animals. It's frequented by hikers and bikers, and some say, well, at least one ghost. I do find it curious to think that my untimely end would ultimately be the historic event most cited for christening Dead Man's Hollow with its name, since so many other stories surrounded in shadow and mystery abound. In fact, just 7 years prior to my becoming part of the legend, a group of adventurous boys had found a man hanging from a tree there. No one knows how long the hapless soul had been swinging from the limb, but it was long enough that he could not be identified. Now, speculation ran rampant. Some people say it was a Ku Klux Klan lynching. Others say it was simply a case of backwoods justice. In any case, whatever violence was perpetuated against the corpse, I cannot say, nor where it is buried, for the crime was never solved. Adding to the mystery is the death of Edward Woods in 1887. Edward was found drowned in the Yawk, near the Hollow. In fact, his hat found right near the entrance. Now, although his death was labeled an accident, many people found the circumstances suspicious, thinking that the Hollow was in some way tied to the death. A few decades later, when the Hollow was home to a few industries, Mike Sacco of the Bowman Brick Plant was found crushed to death between an elevator and the 3rd floor of the warehouse. Nobody knows exactly how this accident happened, as there were no eyewitnesses and no one could say why Mr. Sacco was in that particular position. In 1943, John Cassell's aunt and her lady friend were crossing the Yawk on their way to Versailles. It was a nice day, the water was calm, but a storm brewed. Came in, capsized the boat, both ladies drowned. Mr. Cassell found this particularly eerie because just 7 years prior, he was born in the Hollow. Many felt the Hollow had just balanced the scales. Now, not all stories are about Dead Man's Hollow or deal with death. Some just with oddity. I recount a story from the newspaper in the late 1800s where a man said he claims to have seen a serpent there measuring 30 to 40 feet in length, with a head 2 to 3 feet in circumference. This man was not ashamed to admit the sight of the beast terrified him so that he swooned. Now, a group of intrepid boys and men made perfunctory searches of the area, some claiming to have seen or heard something. I feel I should add the Hollow was home to many moonshine stills hidden in it, but what exactly prompted these sightings I cannot say.
Wasn't that cool? So many interesting facts that you can live on Living History Tour. I hope you guys get interested for next year's Living History Tour because I know I will. I mean, after so many events that got canceled, I really am glad to go to this one. So, if you want to see more of my videos, just go to my blog, which is T.I.E blog on YouTube, or you can listen to me on my podcast, Anchor.fm or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Together Individual Entertainment. And you're wondering what my podcast name is? It's still T.I.E blog. So, I hope you have a nice little events going on, whatever you're doing, just have fun with it and just roll right through it. Bye.